All right, welcome to our deep dive.
Yeah,
You ready to get into some seriously thought-provoking stuff?
always.
We've got these lecture excerpts from this, I don't know, you could call him a leading intellectual figure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about power dynamics and how they shape the world. And
Yeah.
we're going to be looking at some, political theory stuff about the media. So buckle up.
It's going to be a ride.
Yeah, it's going to be dense, but it's going to be good.
Yes.
It's kind of easy to just take for granted, how we see the world, right?
Yeah.
All the information that we just consume on a daily basis.
Absolutely. But it's all like influenced by these forces that we don't even realize, right?
Really, and that's what we're going to be getting into.
That's the deep dive.
Yeah, the deep dive, exactly. So let's start with this. Even mainstream thinkers acknowledge that there's a kind of conspiracy going on among powerful elites.
Oh, yeah.
You know that Adam Smith quote
Yeah.
about how businessmen are always conspiring against the public good?
Right. Well, I mean, it is kind of funny when you think about it, but
Yeah.
it points to something that we've seen for centuries and centuries.
Cool.
People in power, they look after themselves.
Right.
And sometimes, maybe not for the rest of us.
Yeah, and this isn't just some fringe idea.
Right.
There was this article in the Financial Times recently, and they had a BBC correspondent
Oh, well.
talking about how organizations like the G7 and the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO,
Huge organization.
yeah, like a de facto world government
Mhm.
serving transnational capital interests.
Interesting.
So is this are we getting a glimpse behind the curtain here? Or is this just another conspiracy theory?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those organizations, they definitely have a lot of influence on global policy,
Oh, for sure.
economic trends.
Yeah.
But the reality is probably a lot less exciting than people think.
Okay.
Like, take the Trilateral Commission, for example.
Right.
I mean, so many conspiracy theories about them.
Oh my God, yeah.
But when you actually look at the stuff they publish,
Yeah.
it's pretty boring.
Okay, so speaking of the Trilateral Commission,
Mm-hmm.
their 1975 publication, The Crisis of Democracy,
Oh, right.
right?
Wow.
It's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
It came out right after all of the, social and political upheaval of the 60s.
No, on crazy time.
Oh, yeah. And you can really feel the anxiety in their words.
Yeah, the historical context is so important, right?
Totally.
The 60s, you had the civil rights movement, women's lib, all the anti-war protests.
Yeah.
The people in power, they felt like their authority was being challenged.
Right, things were getting out of control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting and maybe kind of disturbing how they frame it,
Oh,
right?
totally.
Like, they saw increased participation from marginalized groups as a problem. Like, more democracy was a crisis of democracy.
Right. That's so messed up.
Yeah, it's this weird paradox,
Yeah.
right? How do we understand democracy? Is it about everyone participating? Or is it about keeping things stable, even if it means shutting some people out?
Yeah, and I mean, they definitely seem to be leaning toward that second one.
Yeah, the crisis of democracy, it basically argues that too much democracy makes things unstable,
Right.
that institutions need to be protected from the demands of the masses.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, they want to keep things how they are,
for sure.
keep the power where it is.
Totally. And there's this anecdote about Samuel Huntington, who wrote the U.S. section of that document.
Okay.
He apparently talked about the good old days when Truman could just run the country with a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers.
Wow, so that's really telling.
Yeah.
Like, they missed the time when a small group of people made all the decisions.
Right, without having to listen to all the, the riffraff.
Exactly. Like, they don't want to be bothered by the people they're supposed to be representing.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It is.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about Cuba. It might surprise you to know that Cuba was actually the first foreign policy problem for the U.S.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, way back in the 1820s.
Wow.
What's the story there?
Well, Cuba is really close to the U.S., right?
Yeah.
And it's super important in the Caribbean.
Strategically, yeah.
Yeah, so from the very beginning, it was a target for American expansionism.
So this early tension, it sets the stage for the whole history of U.S.-Cuba relations.
It's like a tug of war
Yeah,
over control and influence.
totally, for a century.
Yeah. And the U.S., they've consistently tried to dominate Cuba economically, politically,
Using whatever they could. Right.
pretty much.
Military intervention, sanctions.
Yeah.
Wait, but hold on. Wasn't the main problem with Cuba the whole communism thing with Castro?
Yeah, that's how it's usually portrayed.
Right.
But the justifications for intervention, they've kind of changed over time.
Okay.
First, it was about protecting American business interests. Then it was about fighting communism.
Right.
But the real goal, maintaining control, that's always been the same.
So you're saying even if Castro hadn't, like, aligned with the Soviet Union, the U.S. would have still intervened?
There's a lot of evidence that points to that.
Okay.
The U.S. made a formal decision to overthrow Castro in 1960.
Really?
Before the Soviets were really involved.
Wow.
The nationalization of American businesses, that was a big factor.
Okay, that's really interesting because it really challenges that traditional narrative that the U.S. was just trying to stop the spread of communism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Cold War, it was a convenient excuse to keep being aggressive towards Cuba. But the desire to control the island, that was there way before.
So you're talking about, like, the Spanish-American War.
Exactly. The U.S., they intervened, supposedly to liberate Cuba from Spain, but they ended up basically turning it into an American plantation.
And then in 1934, when Cuba tried to elect a moderately socialist president, the U.S. stepped in again. Showing they just really wanted to control Cuba.
Yeah, anytime Cuba tried to assert their independence, especially if it challenged U.S. economic or political dominance, they met resistance.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
The U.S. saw any movement towards genuine independence as a threat.
A threat to their power.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then you have the whole Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, yeah.
So much drama.
Yeah, those events were big.
Yeah.
But they're just part of a much longer story.
Right.
Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, U.S. policy towards Cuba barely changed.
It's crazy how much the media shapes our understanding of these things.
It is.
If we're only getting the U.S. perspective, of course we're going to see Cuba as the bad guy.
Right.
But when you actually zoom out and look at the big picture,
it's a different story.
Totally different.
Yeah, this is why it's so important to be media literate.
Yes.
To look for different perspectives.
Absolutely.
If we only get our information from one source, we might end up believing things that aren't really true.
Right, and that serve the interests of, the powerful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of reflecting the complex reality of the situation.
So what we're seeing here is that U.S. intervention in Cuba, it wasn't really about communism.
Right.
It was about maintaining control.
Exactly. They made Cuba into this security threat.
Yeah.
Especially during the Cold War.
To justify all their aggressive policies and to get public support.
Against this enemy, right?
Against this enemy.
Yeah.
Okay, this brings us to a bigger question. How much power do corporations actually have?
Oh, good question.
And why should they have any rights at all?
That's a provocative one.
It is, and our speaker really goes there.
Oh, wow.
He argues that the rise of corporate power has really, messed up the balance of power in our society, often at the expense of individual rights and democratic principles.
That makes sense.
He even compares corporations to totalitarian ideologies.
That's a bold statement.
Isn't that a little extreme?
It is strong.
I mean, don't corporations also create jobs?
Yeah, and innovation.
Innovation.
Yeah.
So there's good and bad, right?
Sure. But he's arguing that the way corporations are structured, they're hierarchical.
Yeah.
They're focused on profit above all else.
Right.
And they can influence the government.
Yeah.
That's all similar to totalitarian regimes.
Okay.
He even talks about this economist, Robert Brady, who said corporations are inherently totalitarian.
Really?
Yeah, because of their centralized power and how they control individuals.
I see what he's saying, but it still seems like a stretch to compare them to, actual dictatorships.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely provocative.
Yeah.
But it's meant to make us think critically about concentrated power.
Okay.
Whether it's in the hands of a state or a corporation.
It can be dangerous either way.
Right. It can threaten individual freedom and democratic values.
Right.
So it's something to think about.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah. He also points out that corporate rights aren't even mentioned in the Constitution.
Oh, that's interesting.
They were basically established through court decisions and legal maneuvering.
And how did that happen?
It's a long and kind of messed up story.
That bad.
The rise of corporate personhood.
Right.
The expansion of corporate rights. These are all legal constructs that have totally shifted the balance of power in our society.
Wow.
He mentions this Harvard law professor, Morton Horowitz,
okay,
who wrote about how the legal system was basically reshaped to serve private power.
So instead of corporations serving the public,
Yeah.
the system was rigged to serve them.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, and he gives some specific examples like how New Jersey And Delaware lured corporations away from New York by offering all these tax breaks and incentives.
So taxpayers are basically subsidizing these companies.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem right.
Not at all.
What about the argument that those tax breaks create jobs?
Right. That's what they always say.
But some people call it corporate welfare.
Yeah. It's like using public funds to benefit private corporations.
Right.
Often under the guise of economic development.
But then they cut social programs and public services.
Right. So it's a trade-off.
Okay, so we've gone from like shadowy cabals to Cuban conspiracies to corporations acting like mini dictatorships.
It's a lot.
I'm starting to see how these things are all connected, but where does it all lead?
Well, our speaker argues that this concentration of corporate power has huge consequences, especially when it comes to how we understand the world.
Okay.
And the choices we're given.
So you're talking about the media.
Exactly.
He's saying there's a direct link between corporate power and how the media shapes our perception of the world.
It all ties together.
Yeah, so instead of the media being this watchdog for the public good, it's become another tool for corporate influence.
That's a big concern.
Yeah.
He talks about media consolidation.
Okay.
Where a few huge corporations control all the information.
Right, and they can shape the narrative.
Exactly.
To benefit their own interests.
Yeah, it's a self-serving cycle.
It's kind of scary.
It is, because it raises questions about whether we're getting a diversity of viewpoints.
Yeah.
And whether the media can be manipulated.
Instead of getting a range of perspectives,
right,
we're only getting the perspective that serves those in power.
It's a problem.
That's really alarming. What are the consequences of that?
Well, think about it. How often does the media frame issues from a business perspective?
Oh, all the time.
Not from the perspective of what's good for the public.
Yeah.
So corporate agendas end up shaping the narrative.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. You might see more coverage about how a new regulation hurts corporate profits.
Right.
Than about how it would actually benefit public health or safety.
It's like a subtle form of propaganda.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
And it makes it really hard for other perspectives to be heard.
Right. If all the big media outlets are saying the same thing, people just assume it must be true.
It's tough to break through that.
He even talks about how the media could be this liberating force, but instead it's used for propaganda and manipulation.
It's a powerful tool.
It is, and it can be used for good or for bad.
And right now, it's not being used for good.
It's pretty depressing.
It is, but it's a reminder that we need to be critical.
Yeah.
We need to question the motives of the people who control the information we get.
So what can we do about it? This seems huge.
That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now, think about this.
Right.
If knowledge is power and access to information is controlled by a few, what does that mean for individual freedom and democracy?
That's a good one. I'm going to have to think about that.
Me too.
Okay, well, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more from these lectures after the break. Welcome back. So before we went down this rabbit hole of like corporate power and media manipulation, we were talking about how, the people in power, they shape the narratives we consume.
Right. And those narratives, they can be used to justify all sorts of things.
Like policies and stuff.
Exactly. Both domestic and foreign.
Yeah. Our speaker brought up the example of the mill hands in Lowell, Massachusetts back in the 1800s and how they believed that the people who worked in the mills should own them.
Right. Like worker ownership.
Yeah. It seems pretty radical even today.
It is a powerful idea. The idea that workers should have control over their own labor.
Yeah, I can see how appealing that is, but how realistic is that, really? I mean, could we actually dismantle these giant corporations and replace them with, like, worker-owned co-ops?
Our speaker, he reminds us that there are solutions that have worked throughout history.
Okay.
Like, think about the struggle for workers' rights in the 1930s. It wasn't through revolution. It was through organized labor.
Right. Collective action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes even just the threat of more radical change.
So you're saying change is possible?
Oh, absolutely.
Even within the system as it exists now?
History shows us that change is inevitable. Systems evolve, power dynamics shift.
But the question is...
The question is, what role will we play in shaping those changes?
I like that. So what can we actually do? Like, how do we move from awareness to action?
He emphasizes education and organizing.
Okay.
He argues that the fight for workers' rights has always been about winning over hearts and minds.
Right, like countering the propaganda.
Exactly. We need to push back against that constant stream of corporate messaging.
Yeah, and build solidarity.
Yeah, a sense of shared purpose.
But it feels like we're up against such massive forces.
It can feel that way.
How can we as individuals actually make a difference?
Well, he reminds us that every gain in workers' rights, every improvement in working conditions, it's come through struggle.
Okay.
And that every generation builds on the victories of those who came before.
So we're part of a larger movement.
Exactly.
Even if we don't see the results right away.
Right. Progress is rarely linear.
Yeah.
It's messy. It takes time.
But we can learn from the past.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can draw inspiration from all the people and movements that have fought for a more just world.
Okay, I'm feeling a little more hopeful.
Okay.
But there's still this issue of how powerful forces use fear and manipulation.
Oh, yeah.
Like, our speaker talked about how the Cold War was used as this bogeyman
It was a very effective tool.
to justify all sorts of policies.
Mm-hmm. The Cold War really shaped public opinion.
Right.
It created this climate of fear.
Where the government could do whatever it wanted.
Right. They could increase military spending, suppress dissent, intervene in other countries.
All in the name of fighting communism.
Exactly.
And now that the Cold War is over, it seems like they're just looking for the next enemy.
You're right. Our speaker points to this trend of finding new threats, whether they're real or imagined.
Like what?
Terrorism, drug trafficking, crime, even welfare queens.
It's like they always need a villain.
The tactics might change.
Right.
But the goal is always the same. Control the narrative. Maintain power.
It's so cynical.
It is, but we need to be aware of it.
To resist it.
Exactly. Critical thinking, media literacy, skepticism.
Those are our weapons.
They are. Don't fall for the emotional appeals, the simple explanations.
Right. Always ask yourself, who benefits from this?
Exactly.
Okay, our speaker also talked about this search for a new paradigm.
Oh, right.
A new way to frame global conflicts and justify intervention.
After the Cold War ended, they needed a new framework.
What was he getting at?
Well, he mentioned Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis.
Okay.
The idea that the world is now divided along cultural and religious lines.
And Islam is the new enemy.
Basically, it's portrayed as the main threat to the West.
But isn't that a huge oversimplification?
It is. Our speaker is very critical of Huntington's thesis.
Okay.
He points out all the flaws and inconsistencies.
Like what?
Well, for example, the most fundamentalist Islamic state, Saudi Arabia, is a close U.S. ally.
Yeah, that doesn't really fit the narrative.
It doesn't. It shows that it's really about geopolitical interests.
Right, and maintaining U.S. power.
Exactly.
Not some ideological battle.
But even though it's flawed,
Yeah.
this clash of civilizations idea, it's taken hold in the media.
And in politics.
And it's shaping how people see the world.
It all comes back to being critical thinkers.
It does.
We can't just accept what we're told.
We have to question everything.
Seek out different perspectives.
Exactly. And that brings us back to education.
Yeah.
If we want to break free from these cycles of manipulation, we need to learn how to think for ourselves.
How to question authority and how to challenge the status quo.
That's what real education is all about.
And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive.
Man, we've covered a lot, huh?
We have.
Like from, those kind of shadowy elite organizations to all the subtle ways that corporations are messing with our lives.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. It's pretty heady stuff, but hopefully you're feeling a little more, informed.
And empowered.
Yeah, empowered. That's the word.
It's about understanding the system.
Yeah.
And knowing that we can do something about it.
Exactly. You've talked about education being a key part of that. But our speaker, he seems to be talking about a different kind of education.
Oh, yeah.
Than what we usually think of. He keeps using the term Enlightenment principles.
Right. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. What does that even mean?
So he's talking about those core values that were championed by Enlightenment thinkers.
Okay.
Like, Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson.
Guys.
Yeah, things like individual liberty, self-governance, the right of people to control their own labor and their own destiny.
Right. Those are big ideas.
They are. And he sees them as really important for challenging concentrated power and creating a more just society.
But wait, hold on. Didn't Adam Smith also advocate for, free markets and limited government?
Yeah.
How does that fit with all this critique of corporate power?
That's a great point, and I think it shows how much things have changed since Smith's time.
Right.
The corporations today, they're global. They're incredibly wealthy.
Yeah, they have so much power.
And they can influence governments in ways that Smith never could have imagined.
So it's not about like rejecting capitalism altogether. It's about, making sure it works for everyone.
Exactly, not just the people at the top.
Right, and maybe rethinking how we do things.
Reclaiming those core principles of the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Reason, individual liberty, democratic participation, and using them to solve the problems we face today.
Okay, so our speaker also talks a lot about the importance of people having control over their own work.
Oh, yeah.
Not just being, cogs in a machine.
Right. He even quotes this 18th century thinker who said,
Okay.
if a person does beautiful work under external command, meaning for wages, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is.
Wow, that's pretty harsh.
It is, but it really gets to the core of the issue.
Okay.
Like, when our work is just about following orders and getting a paycheck,
Yeah.
it can be really alienating.
We're not really expressing ourselves.
Exactly.
We're just doing what we're told.
And he contrasts that with the experience of, say, academics.
Like university professors.
Yeah, they have a lot of control over their own work.
They choose their research topics. They set their own schedules.
They have autonomy.
Yeah, but most people don't have that luxury.
That's true.
Most of us just take whatever jobs we can get.
Right, but that doesn't mean we should give up on the idea of worker control.
Okay.
There are models out there like worker-owned co-ops that show us a different way of doing things.
Okay, I get it. Educate ourselves, organize, explore different models.
Yeah.
But what about those big picture issues?
Like global power dynamics.
Yeah, and the search for a new paradigm. What can we do about that?
Remember what that Mexican ambassador said about Cuba being a threat?
Oh, yeah.
He said something like, 40 million Mexicans will die laughing.
Right, he just thought it was absurd.
Yeah, it highlights how ridiculous these narratives can be.
So we need to question those narratives.
Yes.
Challenge the assumptions. And look for different perspectives.
Exactly. Don't accept simple explanations or easy scapegoats.
Right.
Look for the power dynamics, the vested interests, the historical context.
It's like we need to develop this internal BS detector.
I like that.
To filter out all the propaganda and misinformation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's really what our speaker is advocating for.
Okay.
An education that helps us see the world clearly, question authority, and demand a system that works for everyone.
That's a great goal, but it feels kind of overwhelming.
It can.
Like, where do we even start?
Well, remember, the world is always changing.
Okay.
And we have the power to shape that change.
Yeah.
It starts with small steps.
Like what?
Educating ourselves, engaging in critical thinking, connecting with others who share our concerns, and supporting organizations that are working for change.
So it's not about feeling powerless. It's about recognizing that we can make a difference.
Exactly. We might not be able to change everything overnight.
Yeah.
But we can push for reforms, chip away at the system, and create a world where power is shared more equally.
Well said. I think our listener has a lot to think about after this deep dive.
I hope so.
It's a lot to process, but hopefully it's just the beginning.
Yeah, the beginning of their journey.
Yeah, towards understanding and challenging these complex issues.
And hopefully they'll be inspired to learn more, explore different perspectives, and engage with the world in a more informed and empowered way.
That's what we're all about here.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We encourage you to keep exploring these important topics.
Keep learning, keep questioning.
Remember, knowledge is power, but only if we use it to make the world a better place.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time.